Grow, Sell, and Retire is the podcast for the lazy overachiever. BD Dalton, author of The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and Grow, Sell, and Retire, is here to give his 25 years of secrets, tips, and assistance to take your business to the next level. This podcast is for anyone who wants to sell more, work less, and make better business. Now, here's your host, BD, with today's GSR podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast. We're going to be talking today with Dave Dodson on our second of our little mini series here on crushing the competition. Last episode, we talked about management superpowers. Today, we're going to talk about creating employee heroes. Dave, welcome back to the Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
It's cool. So if you're a manager, that's great. But if you have nobody to manage, what's the point of being a manager? You're right. Superfluous to the organization. You could be a CEO of one. So how, in your experience, what are the key ingredients to turning the average employee into a hero within the company? And kind of some reference, there's the Toyotas and the Hondas and all that type of stuff, but employee kind of getting them to be the superheroes so that they can bring in better clients for you.
Yeah, what a great opening question. And BD, it reminds me of a very quick story. I had finished the whole book, The Manager's Handbook, and I was really proud of it because it took 3 years of research. I thought I had nailed it. And I was with a friend of mine who runs one of the largest real estate firms in the US. And he asked me this question. He said, so what companies or organizations embrace these 5 skill areas? And I am so embarrassed, BD, to tell you that I realized right then that I had missed a fundamental part of my work, which is that I was always asked questions, well, what leaders do these 5 things? And he was asking a far more important question, which is what organizations embrace these 5 skills. And that's when the light bulb went off. As embarrassing as it was, the light bulb went off and I realized, wait a minute. The last missing ingredient is that these are people who, of course, have to learn the skills themselves, but then they convert themselves and all of their focus is on being a teacher or a coach. So that's why the essence of your question is really fundamental to building an organization. As you said, you use the expression being a CEO of one. You're not going to get anywhere that way. You have to be able to push these skills throughout the organization. And you use the expression of a hero. And I think it starts with thinking about how are you going to define what a hero is? And I think it's as simple as this. Someone who excels at their job to the level that they're capable of day in and day out. Now, we had that tragic airline accident 2 weeks ago, Japan Airlines. It came down and hit another plane. But every single one of those passengers on that Japan airline plane got off safely and walked off the plane. And you would say, well, all of the crew were heroes. They were heroes because they were well trained, they knew how to execute, and they knew how to get things done. It was about execution in those 90 seconds that saved the lives of everybody. By the way, that's true if you're making an omelet or you're mowing someone's lawn or you're doing their accounting work. It's about excelling in your job. And in order to make that happen, there really is a process. And you can't sort of sprinkle pixie dust like you're some Marvel superhero and say, okay, well, now all of a sudden I've made these people heroes. You have to actually walk them through the steps, like learning how to play the piano. So for example, let's say I said to you, BD, you need to be better at making decisions. You need to make better decisions. Well,
you've been talking to my wife then. So I need to make better decisions. And my kids would probably chime in there too, as I need to make better decisions.
Well, you picked her, so that was a good decision.
Yes.
But of course, that's a little use to you. But if instead I said, I want to show you how to run more effective meetings, so you can get the input from your team in an organized way, which is going to lead to better meetings, which is going to lead to you making better decisions. And of course, I describe in one chapter the 7 steps of running a good meeting. And it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You do those 7 steps, you'll run good meetings. So it's those kind of building blocks that then you create these heroes.
And so when you're doing that, and it comes back, and I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, the Event Selling Podcast today, and the guys that were on there were talking about their one word for the quarter, not for the whole year, not for their whole life, but their one word for the quarter. And one of the guys, Brian, said his was systems or process, kind of that. So how do you get people to understand that they have a free flow, but it's a free flow in a direction like of client care or something like that, so that converts into bottom line? How do we think about that as managers, giving people their freedom by giving them a process to deliver for us?
Exactly. So why don't I just go back to the example that I just stated about running a good meeting? And in the book, I have the 7 steps to running a good meeting. You could hear that and say, oh, well, you're taking away my degrees of freedom. I want to run a meeting. No, it's actually quite the opposite. When you build a framework, what you do is you create the opportunity for people to focus on the framework is to bring out the creative energies. So for example, in the 7 steps to run a good meeting, the first thing that you do, or the second thing that you do, is you define what is the problem we're trying to solve or the opportunity we're trying to take advantage of. It's a very simple question. But if you have not framed that question well, you are not going to have a creative process that follows from it. So what you're doing is you're maximizing the creativity that the employee has. Same thing would be, let's say, if you were having a process about hiring. You're not saying that you plug everything into a computer and hit the button and it says hire this person or not. You're saying here's a way to ask questions in a way that you will pull out and mine the best data so you can use your judgment to decide whether this person is a good fit or not for the company.
And I think that's amazing when you came back to the Japan Airlines thing, is that's just a process. When this happens, that happens, this happens. And you don't know if you're going to have 7 screaming babies in the cockpit or in the airplane or the fuselage or whatever else, but you know exactly what you're going to be doing. And that I think helps us in business and helps us in that way. Hopefully, when we get to the next episode, which is on strategy, we've now got our managers in line and thinking about stuff. We've now got our superheroes in the employees, and we can move things forward. So how have you seen it, either in the work that you did previously, that you celebrate your employees? So now that you've kind of got them some systems and now they're running better meetings, how do you, besides hanging up like we did back in the 80s and 90s and hang plaques on the wall and employee of the month and greeter of the month at Walmart, how do you celebrate employees without going over the top and putting crowns on them or things like that?
Yeah, you and I probably remember the cat hanging on the chin-up bar saying "hang in there" and all the posters, and I began my management career in that era where we thought, oh, well, you order these posters and put employee of the month in front of one of the parking spots, and then your work is done. And of course, it had absolutely no impact whatsoever. The notion of employee morale happens naturally when the team is winning. Now, BD, I think I'm probably going to get on a little sensitive point here, but I don't know if you, my guess is that you were a Washington fan, not a Michigan fan in the college championship game.
Yep. Yeah. Huskies, go Huskies.
Yeah, well, I'm a Michigan fan, okay, so I was happy. Yes. So let's imagine that locker room that, last week when they won the college championships. The coaches didn't have to do anything to gin up morale. Morale was high because they won, all right? And winning in and of itself creates morale. So if your focus is, I'm going to create good morale and therefore will win, you have it completely backwards. You have to say, we have to figure out how to win the game, however you define the game. And the morale will happen naturally among people who want to be championships. And so an essential aspect of that, though, is having a feedback loop, which includes sort of recognition and reward. And it starts with, one of the 5 skills that's outlined in the book is an ability to set and adhere to priorities. So the first thing you have to do is you have to say, this is what we're working on. Now, that's not the idea of the month or the idea of the morning that the CEO came up with or the manager came up with while they were driving to work. You have to have a process in place to figure out what it is we're working on. And in an earlier episode, you and I had an interesting conversation about how Apple Computer did that. So you run through this process, you say, this is what we're working on, and we're not working on anything else. So step 1 is defining that. Then you have to have a way to be able to recognize when people who are working on those things succeed, and then you reward them. Now, a colleague of mine at Stanford Huggy, he has an expression called sudden bonus. And I sort of lay out because I love how he describes it. And it's a way to reward people in a very simple way to say, you know what? That's what we're working on. You did that really well. I want to reward you for it. And by the way, I'm glad that other people are watching while I'm rewarding you for it. And having these like techniques in place that you can use. And now, so you've got this feedback mechanism where you've said, here's what we're working on. Here's how I'm going to recognize it. Or here's how we measure it. Here's how I'm going to recognize it. So people do more of that. And then morale happens.
And that's cool. And so here's the thing. And every once in a while, and I live in England. I'm a Yank in England. So I've got a little bit desensitized, and I don't do as much rah-rah as I used to. I was jumping around because that's so American. But how do you get around the naysayers or the people that are actually kind of that bad culture inside of your good culture, even if they're good workers, but they start to create this bad culture of saying, oh, they just rewarded Dave and he just keeps getting all this kudos, even though he's doing great stuff for the company. Where's mine? And Dave's the teacher's pet. How do we work people out if they don't fit into the culture?
Well, for starters, if you have defined carefully what it is we're working on and how we're measuring it, there's no teacher's pet piece. There's no teacher's pet. The teacher's pet is when everything gets kind of nebulous and it's who likes who and who's playing the politics and so forth. But if I say, this is how we define success, and you did that and you're rewarded for it, no one's going to fault you for it because that's exactly what we said we were going to do. But of course, sometimes you do have to, you're dealing with people who are maybe having what I call more fundamental problems. And so while I talk about instant performance feedback and the 6 steps to instant performance feedback, which is what you do kind of day in and day out, I think what you're talking about is, well, what happens if someone has a more fundamental problem? Maybe they're not a fit. And in chapter 5, I address this very specifically. And the first step you have to do, BD, is you have to ask yourself, is this a problem with the player or the coach? If I can stay with the sports analogy for a second.
Yep.
And there's some steps you go through. You don't have to do it intuitively. If you do it intuitively, you're going to make mistakes. If you do it methodically, you're going to hardly ever make a mistake. So the first thing is you focus on the behavior, not the person. I remember a student who came to me once and they said she was several years out of had graduated from the MBA program at Stanford, and she had a director of sales reporting to her. And she said, I think I need to let the person go. And I said, well, what would have to change for their behavior for you to have a different point of view? And she didn't have a good answer. So I said, well, come back next week. So she came back next week. And she said things like, it would be better if he were able to hire people better, for example. Well, what would he need to do to hire people? So we broke it down and we said, oh, wait a minute, this is actually not about the person. This is about the behaviors. And then the second step is it attribute-based or skill-based? So if it's skill-based, then you just need to teach them those skills. And as your coach, that's your job. If it's attribute-based, then you kick through the last thing, which is this person coachable or not? And in the book, I outline a series of questions that you can ask quite simply to figure out whether this person's coachable or not. Now, I had a person who was a senior officer of mine in a company, and he had a lot of the characteristics that you just described, very rough around the edges, bad for morale, so forth. And I went through this process, and he was absolutely a coachable person. And it was his behaviors. It wasn't that he was a bad person, that he didn't like people. It was how he interacted. And so I described to him the behaviors, and I, using the one of the techniques in the book, instead of saying, if you don't do this, you're going to lose your job, I said, if you do this, you will be more successful in your job and you'll be promotable. So I put it in his best interest. And then there's a concept called the setup to fail, which is essential that you address when you're dealing with people who have these kind of more fundamental issues. And there's 3 steps in it. And one of which, for example, is you need to make it clear to the person that you think they will succeed. So I said to him, I said, I know you can do this. If I didn't think you could do this, we'd have a different kind of conversation. My job is to help you to succeed. And then it went through the other 2 steps along the way. this person today is probably one of the best CEOs I have ever gotten to know. But had I not followed this process, BD, I probably would have let him go.
Yeah.
And what a waste of an incredible talent.
That's amazing. So sometimes it's the process or the systems that are behind it, and it's not the person sometimes. So we've just hired a couple of new people. In the book, you talk about the first 100 days, kind of a 100-day plan for when you're bringing people in to the culture, because you've got the deer in the headlights and so much information flying at you and all that type of stuff. So walk us through the thought process, because if we're trying to build this superhero team behind us, we have to have some sort of integration, besides a welcome pack and your poster that we'd put on the wall back in the 80s. That they get. So walk us through the first 100 days that you think is essential for new employees or even reintroducing employees.
I'm glad we're talking about this, because the hiring process, it takes a lot of time and a lot of attention. And then what we tend to do, having gone through this process, is sort of throw the stuff over the top of the cube to the other person and let them do their magic. And if you've hired someone who's highly talented, they don't want to say, oh, wait a minute, this is too much too soon, because they want to do a good job. And so you've got this dangerous cycle where the manager gives the person too much stuff to do too fast, too early. The person doesn't want to say no. And you've created a situation where they're not going to maximize their chances to succeed. So this is the 100-day window. And what we've learned is that 100 days is not picked randomly. It's a critical part of the hiring process, and it has two work streams. The first is you will learn more about that person in the first week when they're working for you than you learned about them during the entire hiring process. So one work stream is an organized way to figure out, did I make a good hiring decision or not? Even the best people at hiring only hire at about 73% success rate.
Wow.
So you have to figure out early on. And by the way, it's in their best interest too, because if they're not going to work out and you let them go and have that difficult conversation after 3 or 4 weeks, they don't even have to have you on their resume. But if you wait until it's 4 or 5 months from now and you terminate them, okay, that's a black mark on their resume. So you're doing them a favor, by the way, by driving to this decision early. But if you just say, hey, BD, let's just keep an eye open on Margaret and make sure that we made a good decision, we will have a confirmation bias, and we will convince ourselves that we hired a good person. So what I do is I outline in the 100-day window a specific process and questions that you ask among the hiring team to make sure that you're disciplined about, did I make a good hiring decision? Then the second thing that you do is you have to transition these people in a way that maximizes success. So whether it's bringing in their reporting relationships one by one, it's making sure that they spend the first couple of weeks and they can go and they can see what other people in the company does. I lay out how you need to make sure that they understand what the norms are within the company. Do people go out on Thursday night as a group, or do they not? I mean, that stuff really, really matters. And what we know now, and it's even more critical with the issues of remote work, we know now that if you can get a talented person and you can get them past their 100-day window, there's a statistically much higher chance that they stay forever or for a long period of time. And the reason is this. During that 100 days, when there's a little bit of kind of uncertainty and you don't know the norms and you don't know where to park and so forth, it's easier for someone on LinkedIn to go grab you and say, hey, come work for me for a little bit more money. But once you get embedded into the company and the culture and the people that you like, it's much harder for a competitor to pull you out. So it's also a retaining tool.
And everybody's looking for retention right now. I know we're kind of at a high job kind of unemployment rate right now, or high employment rate. Then
right.
So that at this point in time, so it makes it challenging to hold on to the right people, and that's a big thing. I mean, human capital, or whatever you want to call it, it's definitely at a premium right now.
So, and also, BD, I just want to say one other thing. It's everything you're saying, plus the best people have lots of alternatives. So it's not just sort of keeping, and I'm not suggesting you were saying this, but it's not simply keeping the people that you have. It's making sure that your star players are embedded in your company, that you don't lose them.
So if we go back to these the almost the anti-hero theme, and go back to Jack Welch and the old 30-30-30 or whatever it was, where he got rid of 1/3 of the managers every sweep, every go round of the sun, or whatever it was that he did. So going from what we're talking about now in employee superheroes, the engagement, to this fear factor, how has management, in your view, kind of changed as we're going along here? Has it become more fluffy, or have we become more purposeful at the right end of the sword?
I think that Jack Welch's progression was an important step to get where we are today. He had a system which was kind of nicknamed rank and yank.
Yeah.
When he ran GE, and the reason why that was in place is that he wanted to make sure that his managers didn't just sort of give everybody an A, and forcing a curve, and that did in fact create a discipline. And GE was obviously a very successful company under Jack Welch's leadership. However, we've moved from that, and we've said there's two ways to create a discipline about how we measure and coach and get the excellence out of our team. One is we grade them on a curve. We rank and yank. Okay, that sort of works. But the other is that we build in place a process on how do we actually measure people, and how do we go to those people and say, well, you're not going to work, you're not working out, or you are working out, or your behavior needs to change, and here's how it needs to change. And what you do then is you can have a situation where if you have 10 people in your department, you don't have to get rid of 2 or 3. You can have 10 out of 10, or you can have 2 out of 10. But it's a more sophisticated way to rank or a more sophisticated way to measure your employee performance, and then figure out how you, rather than just let them go, how you can try to change their behavior so they can succeed.
So if you were starting a company today, and you were restarting it, so maybe you're starting, I don't care, software, whatever else it is. What are 3 KPIs or 3 OKRs or whatever you want to call them these days? 3 standards that you would focus on first around sales or customer service or whatever it would be. What would be 3 things besides the profit, obviously, of what goes into the bank? What would be 3 OKRs, KPIs that you would focus on right now?
So the first one would be quality. Now that might, again, we were talking about the poster in the lunchroom, right? So that could smack of that, but I'm thinking about quality in a very different way. So the 5th critical skill is this obsession with quality. And it starts with this. If I said to you, which would you fear more? A competitor that had an unbelievable sales and marketing team, or a competitor that had a better product? Of course, you'd fear the person who has a better product. And so the first thing is, how do you measure quality? And how does that feedback loop go? And measuring quality is not what are all of the attributes that I can cram into a product. It's actually a much more it's much more process driven, which is I'll just use, if I can, I'll use Intuit as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Intuit, TurboTax and other accounting software like QuickBooks and so forth. You think about what they do. It's actually not that remarkable. I mean, they're taking accounting, which was invented, on the Medicis, right? And just automating it. Same thing with taxes. Taxes just filling out a form and kicking out a number at the end, right? It's actually not that remarkable. And yet they have dominated that sector for decade after decade after decade. Well, here's one of the reasons why. Is that Cook, who is the leader of Intuit, he's obsessed with a process called follow them home. And what he wants to is he wants to watch people actually use the software. And it's embedded. It's not a cultural thing. It's a process thing. It's embedded in how they do business. And so they're always one step ahead of the competition because they know how their customers rank quality. So honestly, we could do a whole podcast on this subject of quality. But the first one would be quality. The second one would be your ability to attract and hire talent. You cannot build an organization if you're not good at attracting and building talent. So that would be the second one. And there are KPIs around that. And I would build KPIs around that, and you should have KPIs around it. And the third, and I might be cheating a little bit, BD, on this one, because I'm not sure it fits perfectly in a KPI or OKR, but the best people are really, really good at managing their day, and they focus on the important things. And we live in this really, really obnoxious world now where you log in and there are experts who are tapping you on the shoulder every second saying, stop what you're doing, go look at this. Stop what you're doing. This is what happened in Hollywood today. This is what the royal family is doing. This is what happened, and they want to pull you away from what you're doing to look at their advertisements, to buy their products and so forth. It's marketing. And those pressures are extraordinary. And so the best managers and the best leaders are the ones who can teach their organization how to say, no, this is what we're focused on. This is how you quiet those noises, quiet those distractions. Don't pay attention to those emails that are coming in that are reply alls that are not actionable, and focus on moving the organization forward. And going back to the title of your podcast, think of it as a competitive weapon, because most of your competition will not be doing this.
And you only have to do a little bit more of it. That's the craziest thing, is the extra mile is so empty, as they always say. And you've got, I interviewed Nir Eyal, whose book's Indistractable, which is all about this and how he did the brain studies, I think at Stanford also. But he's talked about that. So you've talked about those amazing things, planning your days and things like that. So just one thing that you would say when you're getting to that point, or anything else that you would say, leaving this around employee superheroes or creating super teams, or however we want to look at it, what would be your number one takeaway from this part of the podcast?
Number one takeaway, really simple. You are a coach. You are a teacher. You're not a doer. And making that transition from being a teacher and pushing these skills, these 5 skills into your organization, and learning how to teach your players, hands down, is the differentiating factor between people who have, small to medium-sized companies that do about 3% better than last year, and people that fly past you.
That's amazing. Dave Dodson, Manager's Handbook on crushing your competition, or crushing the competitions, kind of mini Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast. Thank you very much, and looking forward next to talking about strategy.
Thanks for joining us on Grow, Sell, and Retire. For more information, tools, or to book one of our team members to work with your team, business, or to speak at your event or conference, visit rockfind.co.uk. If you like the podcast, you'll love one of BD's 3 books: The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and the book the podcast is based on, Grow, Sell, and Retire. If you want to work for the rest of your life, that is your business. If you don't, that is ours.